evening. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. This is certainly an unprecedented times in terms of really the unknown and really what the future, stands for us. But thank you for joining. Thanks for inviting us into your home, and hopefully we're able to impart a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of assistance in helping us through these sort of uncertain times. So my name is Simon Niblock. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist based here in Austin, Texas. I'm the founder of Simon Niblock Therapy for Men. My clinical specialization is working with gentlemen. However, this particular presentation really pertains to everybody who's currently under the, basically under the pressure of having to adjust to a lifestyle that is certainly very unfamiliar. So thank you for joining. My presentation today is roughly 30 minutes. And here's essentially just a very quick outline of what we're going to be covering. Obviously, with the uncertainty of our world, a lot of people are experiencing a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of intolerance. We're really struggling with the change. We're struggling with the grief of what's happened to the way that we're used to living our lives. So it's really, really difficult. It's really hard to tolerate this. So we're going to explore really the experience of ambiguity, and we're going to explore really the intolerance and the experience of intolerance. We're going to look at how ambiguity impacts our well-being, and then it wouldn't be a true presentation if we didn't look at some practical strategies on actually how to manage uncertainty in this challenging times. So let's begin. Out of the way. I wanted to kick off this presentation with a little brief story about myself. When I was 17, I was still in high school. I was living in New Zealand at the time, and New Zealand, as it's known to be, we're very prone for earthquakes. What we describe as really the shaky eyes. And one day, the region in which I lived in was hit by an incredibly large earthquake. It decimated the entire region. People were displaced. The normal way of life was interrupted. We didn't have the basic amenities. We really didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. But what came out of it was really a lesson that us as individuals and us as a community are extremely resilient, that necessity is the mother of all invention. So when we really come to the fore, we really bring our best selves forward. So the lesson that I learned from that is, even in the most adverse conditions, we can be extremely empowered, we can be very resilient, we can be very tolerant, and we can adapt very quickly. Just wanted to share that little anecdote there. So really, in these moments when life is thrown upside down and we don't know what's happening from one moment to the next, well, we experience intolerance. We are faced with ambiguity. And intolerance in many ways is a very universal experience. We are really unsure of how to really just get through the day. We don't know what to do next. So in many ways, intolerance is actually very, very normal. And we're all experiencing that at the moment. Our frustration, our anger, our disbelief, our grief. We're often faced with the idea that tomorrow is uncertain. There's enormous ambiguity, and really ambiguity stems from situations that are new to us, that are extremely complex, often contradictory. But how we deal with ambiguity is based on, yes, our past experiences. None of us have been in this current situation, so we're experiencing an enormous amount of ambiguity. And of course, we're often faced with contradictory information. So really, to correctly dissect information about an unfamiliar situation certainly does help. But there are ways we can go about doing that. We'll explore that as part of the strategies that I'm going to introduce. There are natural consequences to ambiguity. We experience incredible feelings, angst, fear, feeling overwhelmed, frustration, annoyance, anger, rage. That's all natural. We experience very natural cognitive, our thoughts. We worry about being a burden on others in moments of need. We often feel inadequate because we struggle to provide for our families. The thought that there's nothing we can do. We have those thoughts, these cognitions, these ruminations that run through our mind. These are all very natural. So if you are experiencing these, you're not alone. It's a universal trait. We often experience natural physical consequences as well. So there's a very, very real somatic response: stress, disrupted sleep, fatigue. We get tired very quickly because our routine has been thrown out. So bear in mind that there are also very real physical consequences. Our behavior also changes as well. We find that we worry intensely. There's an enormous amount of rumination. Worry and rumination, in fact, actually a behavior. We find ourselves withdrawing, or we find ourselves yearning to reach out to others. We also take risks when we're in unfamiliar territory too. So we look at ourselves, we need to assess ourselves. We need to look at our emotional state, the thoughts we're having. We need to be mindful of our physical response. We also need to be mindful and be aware of how our behavior is changing too. When we are mindful about these things, when we are aware of these things, we figure out very quickly what we need to do, what is right for us. Excuse me here, just bouncing around a little bit. The skill of tolerance. In these times where there's an enormous amount of intolerance, there's an enormous amount of ambiguity surrounding us, we have to say to ourselves, you've got this. You know what you need to do. You know what's right for you. You're in very complex, uncertain situations. Yes, there is some guidance and there's certainly lots of advice and lots of suggestions, but you know what's best for you. You know what's best for your family. Trust your instincts there. So as part of overcoming ambivalence, becoming more tolerant, you have to sort of recognize this is actually a skill we can develop. I've seen people develop this skill over time, both clinically and in my own experiences in natural disasters or uncertain situations. So developing this as a skill, it allows us to thrive, not just survive in these moments. We get to challenge our thoughts. We get to challenge our perceptions of ourselves. We recognize that, yes, you've got this, that you are, in many ways, a reservoir of untapped potential. There's so much you can do. And sometimes, even when these things are out of our control, we learn to accept. We learn to adapt. So adapting, again, is a skill. It's a trait. We learn to develop and adjust and change depending on the situation. We have an incredible change in our surroundings. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty, but we can learn how to adapt. And when we adapt, well, really adaptability allows us to be able to stay focused, strong, present, allows us to reserve our energies to solve our problems, allowing us to devote our energies to solving problems, as opposed to finding ourselves devoting an enormous amount of energy on just trying to manage our emotions or our responses. It allows us to be clear-headed. It can be a difficult skill to apply, to learn, but in these current circumstances, I think we can do that very quickly. So let's look at some of the strategies. First strategy I'd like to introduce is really identifying and challenging worry. How do we do that? Well, first we ask ourselves, well, actually, what's the problem? Okay, what am I actually worried about? When we reflect on that, we take a bit of time to actually figure out, well, what is ailing me? What am I ruminating about? And when we do that, we take a bit of time, we often uncover the thing that we are actually worried about. There's often a lot to worry about, but the primary thing that we're worried about, am I worried about my children getting sick? Am I worried about losing my job? What will happen if I can't pay the bills? The real underlying concern. Write these things down. Write your concerns down. Put them on paper. Sometimes just getting these things out, expressing them, can be really cathartic. Challenge worry. And this is a very simple little task, a little strategy that can be really valuable. Ask yourself, okay, this two-part question. Is this a solvable problem that I'm facing or an unsolvable problem? You'll be surprised, being very resourceful as we are, we can often find the problem that we're presented with does in fact actually have a solution. It might not be the solution we're after, but there may certainly be a solution. So let's apply that solution. And if it's a problem that I can solve, do I need to worry? Is there something else I'm worried? Is there another problem? Well, let me explore that. Let me determine whether or not there's a solution for that. If we find, asking ourselves this question, is there an unsolvable problem? Am I faced with an unsolvable problem? What do we do with that? Well, in those cases, we're really just left with radically accepting that we are faced with a problem we cannot solve. And as I've written here, we don't have to like it, but in many ways, radical acceptance allows us to be able to move on, allows us to move forward, allows us to remain steadfast and strong. No, I certainly don't like it, but I'm able to then focus on what I can solve. So our first strategy here is identifying and challenging worry. Worry does serve a purpose, but it clouds our judgment if it continues. Our second strategy is harnessing optimism. Now, it's easy to say, okay, remain optimistic in the face of adversity. Remain optimistic in the face of uncertainty. Easy to say, sometimes a little harder to do. But again, it is a skill that we can develop. I often hear people describe, okay, is your current situation, is the glass half full or is it half empty? Well, language is an important thing. So harnessing optimism is really saying, well, yes, okay, I'm expecting more positive outcomes than bad to occur. When we harness optimistic language, we frame our language, we frame the way that we think, the way that we speak, the way we interact with others. And I've actually seen people dramatically change their situation, their perception of the situation, by harnessing optimism in the way that they talk, the way they interact, to look at the way that we say things, okay? Saying things in a way that the glass is half full. And it certainly helps us cope. It offers us reprieve, release from the stress, the worry. And it's something that we can practice. I challenge anybody who's watching this presentation to, for a day, apply and harness optimistic language and see what happens. Our third strategy is looking at routines and habits. When we're developing tolerance, we often know what works for us. We have a certain understanding of structure. We have a certain understanding of routines and habits. We know that these things work for us. So amongst all the change that you might be currently experiencing, take a moment to look at the constructive routines that you have in place. What works around the home? What works with your children? What works with your spouse? Look at these ways that you go about your day, even if it's currently restricted within your own home. What time do you get up? When do you exercise? When do you eat? When do you play? When do you relax? Look at those and say, how can I maintain these as much as I possibly can? What works for me? Those routines, that predictability offers us peace. It offers us calm. Maintaining those as much as possible. The other aspect is don't do too much. Don't change too much in these periods of time. Stick with what works. I know a lot of people are certainly using this time to clean their home, do projects. That's wonderful. But don't burden yourself with too much change. Also look at doing more of what works for you. I have a principle that really says, if it works, do more of it. So if there is a routine or a habit that works in one circumstance, look at how you go about doing look how you go about doing that exercise, that task, that routine, and see if you can apply that to another aspect of your world, another aspect of your life. For example, if somebody's really good at rallying the family to play board games, or maybe they're really good at rallying the family to do other things. That's a really positive, constructive routine or a habit. So looking at what works and seeing if you can apply that to other circumstances. Our fourth strategy is maintaining connection. Now, clearly difficult in this current circumstance. We are physically separated from each other. So I like to think, as opposed to this social distancing, we hear the theme of social distancing, think of it more as physical distancing. But social connection is absolutely critical now more than ever. We have a tendency to really step back and withdraw in these moments of adversity and uncertainty. But what we're finding, what we're seeing really is a rallying of social connection at the moment. And we're being really creative in ways of, maintaining that through technology. I saw an instance the other day of a street party where everybody was distanced, the families were out on the street and talking to each other and sharing a meal while they were out on the street, people popping their heads out of windows, people, talking to their neighbours over the fence, obviously being mindful of really the distance that we have to maintain from each other. But we have the opportunity of actually being really social, maintaining these connections, reaching out to people that we feel might be in need, reaching out to people who are potentially vulnerable. As I've written down there, necessity is the mother of all invention. We can find creative ways to do it. So let's think outside the box here. The fifth strategy is really supporting others. Now, in this current situation, there are a lot of people who their mental health, their emotional health, the issues that they are normally challenged with, they struggle with, that they are currently seeking ways to work through or are working through, their concerns, their challenges are often exacerbated. We often see new or worsening symptoms. So as, say, for example, a partner, a family member, a loved one, a friend, and we can see the signs, we see these natural consequences, we see a change in their emotional state, we see a change in behaviour, we see a change in really their physiological change as well. We see these symptoms, we see things change. At this point, it is absolutely necessary to ask, are you okay? Simply asking, reaching out is sometimes the most supportive thing we can do. And if they if they disclose to us, if they share with us, if they're open to a conversation and they say that they're struggling, the number one thing we can do there is just listen judgmentally, non-judgmentally, to be open to the conversation, to just take on what they have to say. Offer reassurance. Offer them information about the correct information. Encourage them to reach out. Currently at the moment, clinicians like myself, my colleagues, really the mental health profession are responding incredibly to the fact that we cannot see our clients directly. So we're utilizing technology. We're finding really creative ways to maintain the support of our clients, maintain the support of the public. So there is help there. So if people need help, if you feel as though somebody requires support, get them to reach out, or you reach out. Help is there if you need it. Finally, my last strategy, strategy 6, is support yourself. So we talk about supporting others, we talk about maintaining connections. The last strategy is supporting yourself. So looking at caring for yourself, self-care strategies, taking care of your body. So we look at breathing exercises, we look at stretching, yoga, any form of exercise that you're able to do in the home, walking around the block, getting fresh air, meditation, obviously eating well, trying to maintain sleep. Sleep is absolutely critical. If we can maintain sleep, okay, if we can put in place really good sleep practices and rituals, that has a big way of helping us weather uncertainty, moments like this. Reducing substance use, okay? Maintaining, being aware of how much wine we might be drinking or how many cigarettes we're smoking. Okay, so in these moments, these are, just very normal things to go to. These comfort things, these things out of ritual, out of habit. We find that we quite often increase these things. So really just being mindful of what we ingest, what we take, what we do. Rest and unwind. Just giving yourself the opportunity to decompress. Doing the things you enjoy, hobbies, things that interest you. Now, understand that sometimes knowing that we can be cooped up in small confined spaces with extended family, our own family. I know a lot of my clients and my friends have young children. It can be very hard to offer yourself a little bit of space. Ironically, just even over the last sort of week or so, working with a lot of my gentlemen, to find a few quiet moments, even just sitting in the car, is a wonderful way to decompress. It's a quiet space, believe it or not. People are doing it. Staying informed, okay? So utilizing reliable and credible information. There's a lot of information out there. So taking the time to determine where the information is coming from. Is it reliable? Can I trust this? In these times here, understanding that education and information is actually a really important strategy, a really important requirement to be able to maintain tolerance, to address the ambiguity of situations. A practical strategy here is safeguarding your mind. So reducing your news, reducing your social media intake. Now, I understand for a lot of people, that's how we stay connected. But also recognizing that we might find ourselves being drawn to Instagram a little bit too much, or finding ourselves scrolling down on Facebook a little too much. And really what it's doing is actually increasing my anxiety, angst that otherwise I'd be able to sort of manage. But we find it exacerbates that angst, our worry, our rumination. So just be mindful of that. Safeguard your mind. And recognize that, okay, it is okay not to be okay. That holding it together, trying to sort of maintain it. There's moments where we feel overwhelmed. It's okay to recognize that you're human and that we all bear the burden, bear the consequences of the change that we're all going through. And it's okay to ask for help. Those are the 6 strategies. And as we move to the Q&A, if you have any inquiries on how to potentially put these in place, feel free to reach out. Ask questions. How do I do this for myself? You, of anybody, understand the complexity and the nuances of your home, your family, your own world. So take what you can, take what you like from any of these 6 strategies and see if they apply to you. You know, you understand best. You are your own expert. We're offering suggestions and ideas, but how you apply them is entirely up to you. But if you have questions, feel free to come forward and ask. So in summary, you've got this. We've got this. We are working as a collective global family at the moment, trying to work through an enormous amount of uncertainty. But just to say that you are a reservoir of untapped potential. You are creative, you are strong, you are resilient. And sometimes we might not realize it, but it's there. And in terms of ambiguity, the real impact that that has on us emotionally, physically, behaviorally, that's real. Listen to those messages. Take time to listen to yourself. Take time to recognize your environment. Take time to listen to others. Look at these simple and practical strategies of developing tolerance during this uncertainty. Every little bit helps. We might not feel like we're in control of our environment, but you'll be surprised at what you actually have control over. So at this point, I appreciate everybody's time, taking a few moments to listen to this presentation. I'm going to open it up now for Q&A, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in, ask questions. And again, thank you for inviting us into your home, taking the time out to actually learn something maybe a little bit different. I never make the assumption that we all know this stuff. I learn a lot from my clients, and hopefully you've taken a little gold nugget away from today's presentation as well. So I'd like to thank you, and let's open up for Q&A.
Simon, we do have a couple of questions. So I thought I'd start with the first one. Do you have any tips on helping children remain calm and centered when I don't feel calm and centered?
Yeah, that's a really, what do we do when we're when we're not centered? In that case, there the difficulty there is if we don't feel centered, it really does start with us. Our children mirror us, our children model us. So looking at these strategies first for ourselves, if we can say there's just this natural hierarchy when it comes to children. If we take the time to care for ourselves, and we take the time to, let's say, meditate, breathe, step away, calm ourselves down, then we're able to go back to our children and model that. They will see that, they will remain calm. We need to give ourselves time out as parents. And if that is the number one thing we can do, that can be extremely helpful. It is a difficult time for us, and it's a difficult time for a lot of families. So to care for ourselves first, I like to use the analogy, and it's a very often frequently used analogy. I put the air mask on myself first, I care for myself, and then I'm able to care for my children. It's a great question.
Yeah, that analogy is what I thought of as well as you were talking.
Yeah.
So we have another question that I think is a really great one to respond to. Ways to identify when you're heading into kind of an anxiety spiral, and what can you avoid? How do you avoid it before it happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So often people sort of say, I'm experiencing a sudden sort of increase in angst. I can feel the sense of dread or panic. One of the techniques, one of the strategies that we adopt with individuals who come into therapy with this very problem is helping them learn to identify what's happening within themselves, to listen to ourselves. These moments, these very visceral reactions to anxiety are not so much out of the blue. It's often a gradual build. So taking time to sort of just step back and just observe ourselves objectively, to sit back and listen, to take a moment to screen ourselves, to literally work through our body. Imagine, you know, sort of screening yourself through your body and just listening. Okay, where's the anxiety? Where's the tension? How do I feel? What are my thoughts? When we take time to listen to ourselves, we can often circumvent these extreme moments of angst.
I think it's interesting because I know you seem to have mentioned breathing quite a bit in your presentation. Mm-hmm. And I know that certainly is one of the things that we talk about whenever we do some presentations around things like stress management. A lot of folks are not familiar with some of the concepts around controlled breathing. So things like box breathing and alternate nostril breathing. Can you talk a little bit more about breathing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two breathing techniques that that I provide for my clients, the two primary strategies there. One is what we call box breathing. The way that I interpret that, the way that I've learned that, is to look at, imagine the breath that you manage, or the breath process, as four sides of the box. When we breathe in, that is one side of the box. Then we take a moment, we just hold that breath, that's the other side of the box. We exhale, that's the third side of the box. And then we hold that exhale for another moment, and then we breathe in. So if you can imagine the four sides of the box. So we breathe in, we hold, we breathe out, we hold. Now, when we're learning that particular breathing practice, each time, each side of the box, we do that between, say, 3 to 4 seconds. The other technique lends from meditative practices that I've adopted in the past, where we focus on the out breath. We breathe in just normally, and then when we breathe out, we count that. We remain present, and we're really mindful of the exhalation. So we breathe out, 1, and we just breathe in normally. We breathe out, 2, we breathe in, we breathe out, 3. And we do that to the count of 5. So every exhalation, we count 1. And then when we get to 5, we start from 1. Now, the purpose of being this mindfulness breathing practice is really to calm and regulate the central nervous system, our fight or flight, as we like to sort of describe it. And when we do that really just for a very short period of time, and you'll be pleasantly surprised at the calm and the peace that that just creates. And that manages that angst, it manages the rumination, that behavior of rumination, the worry that we quite often experience, by just focusing on that breath and just slowing things down and just regulating the mind and the body. It's a good question.
Okay. Along the same lines of another quick one around anxiety, and then we've got a couple of questions around youth. This one is about someone mentioning that they have a boss who's constantly talking about the virus and how things are going to get worse. Yes. So the question is, do you have any tips for not letting him or other people bring me down or add to my anxiety?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it could be, we can sort of manage this in 2 ways. One is to, if we go back to that strategy of optimistic language, and if we, this is the first sort of approach to this. One is applying that optimistic language. If we say to ourselves, we apply that optimistic language saying, okay, yes, there are others who may have a glass is half empty approach, and sort of really utilizing a lot of negative language to say, I understand why that person's worried. but then to apply that optimistic language for ourselves and to really say, okay, things are okay, you know, things will work out, okay? If that language from that other individual doesn't change after a period of time, okay, and by modeling that optimistic language, some people recognize it's a very subtle way of saying, hey, I need you to change here, I need you to change your language. The other approach is more direct, and where we can go to somebody in a non-accusatory, very compassionate way to say, you know, when you talk this way, when you say the things that you say, it really worries me. It really evokes a lot of angst. And I'd really like if we could adopt a more positive tone, or we could stop talking about this for a period of time and extend an invitation to them. It's difficult to demand. We don't want to demand somebody to stop because that's entirely their prerogative. But if we extend an invitation to them to stop, to change their language, we've done as good a possible job there. We've approached them directly. If that invitation falls on deaf ears, then we might need to look at other strategies. For example, stepping away, creating some different boundaries for ourselves.
Great, thank you. So here's another question that's probably impacting a lot of folks right now, as we have college students who are now having to work from home. So what do you recommend for college or high school or any students who now have to have more work transitioning to online classes on top of being in an environment that's not really conducive to studying, because now they're home instead of being at school?
Yes.
Any suggestions on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is really a case of, you know, that strategy around creating new rituals and habits for ourselves. And this can be really hard because we're often tempted by our environment to lose focus, or we struggle with discipline in this area. And something in terms of a personal account here, both my sons are in exactly the situation. They're both in college and are sort of now having to do school, you know, school from home, where they're used to going to lectures and so forth. So what I have found individuals doing, again, is looking at being very creative, is creating new habits and creating new practices for themselves to say, okay, well, what do I need to do for myself? I know that normally I get up at this time to go to school. I get up at the same time. Stay with that routine. Get up at the same time. Get dressed. Have breakfast at the same time. Have your work environment ready to go. Log into your, you know, your classes. Maintain really the schedule that you would have around deliverables, you know, deadlines and so forth. To really say, okay, well, I may not be able to go to a lecture, but maintaining my existing structure, my existing routines as much as possible, even though that I'm at home, I'm going to try to do that as best as possible. And then what we find is we adjust to really that change very quickly. I hope that helps, the short answer. It might not help.
We could do a whole session on that, I'm sure. So here's another good one that we have another question that I think I've heard a couple of people mention to me. Do you have any tips on supporting someone who's very extroverted? He's someone who needs a lot of socializing and misses physically being around people. They've been trying to connect with people online, but this gap has really taken a toll on their mental health.
Yes, yeah. And this is, you know, we hear a lot of people saying, okay, I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert, and really adjusting to significant change here. If one is by nature a very social person, we might need to find other ways to maintain those social connections. Be it, for example, I know a lot of people are doing happy hours by Zoom. Individuals are hosting, you know, virtual family gatherings. Whilst it doesn't necessarily replace that direct face-to-face contact. I know I was just reading an article yesterday saying an individual who runs one of the biggest UK soccer clubs, says the thing I miss the most is hugging people. Obviously, figuratively hugger, so he's struggling with that. So to say, well, yes, there is this physical distancing that we have to apply, but we can still be in the presence of others. The recommendation is 6 feet from each other and small groups. So we may still be able to connect with others, but understanding there is a restriction. So say, for example, reaching out to your neighbours and sitting out on the front driveway and talking to your neighbours. It may not necessarily direct connection that we have, but it may help that individual. In these instances, with that knowing that we're all individuals and we all have different preferences, really understanding, well, we are creative. So what are the creative ways that you can maintain those social interactions when the normal way that we connect with others is no longer available or currently not available?
Okay.
That answers that question.
This is a little similar to the question earlier, but a little bit different in the sense that it's more of someone who's in a manager position. They say, I'm a manager and one of my team members is preoccupied about the virus and that it affects her and it affects her performance greatly. I'm empathetic and I understand and I try to comfort her, but I'm very analytical and find it difficult to find a way to reach her on a level that really helps her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so and this is where we sort of say, well, in terms of patience and understanding things, and where we struggle to offer real deep understanding for somebody, that is a bit of a tricky question. That is a difficult one because the individual sounds like they're trying to be, they are being empathic, they're being understanding, but really truly understanding somebody's experience. That is something that clearly is, we're all having to learn very quickly. I like to apply what I call the Columbo the Columbo practice. Having a conversation with somebody in a way where you don't know, a not knowing conversation. To go to somebody and say, hey, I'm being open to what you have to share with me. Help me truly understand, what is this like for you? I'm not presuming, I'm not applying my own judgment, but just truly help me understand what this is like for you. And I'm just going to listen. I'm not going to offer advice. I'm just going to be here. I'm going to see you. I'm going to hear you. I'm going to understand you. Yep. And what occurs in those moments is when we open the door to that, often we find that is then reciprocated. And somebody says, well, thank you for taking the time to truly understand what this is like for me. What is it like for you?
I also want to state, I think I'd also like to add that from the standpoint of just workplace settings, that this is a great time if you work in a workplace in which you've got access to benefits that will allow you to, tap into some of the mental health, telehealth. Everyone's going telehealth. And I know I had someone tell me the other day that initially her insurance didn't want to cover it, and then once she called them up and talked to them, they went ahead and let the telehealth was being covered. I think what I'm getting at is that I think, particularly in these workplace settings, I think I think it's a great time to encourage folks to understand that there's other places where they can also be heard and be listened to. And encourage that, because I think in a lot of workplaces, people are not even aware of what some of the resources might be. And so I think it's a great time in workplace settings to find out what those resources are and also share them there. Because it's great to have a place where there aren't any emotional connections, right? Where people will just listen. Simon, here's another question from this woman who says that her brother has agoraphobia, and now he won't even open the curtains in his apartment. He will only answer the door now for me, and he has fear of the unknown. Should I just let it ride, or will this behavior make the fear worse? And I'm assuming that this person is in regards to the current situation, that's what has exacerbated this.
Okay, yeah. So what may have been previously, in some ways, a prior sort of withdrawing behaviour is exacerbated. Is that what I'm sort of understanding?
I think that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think that's what I'm hearing. My brother has agoraphobia, and now he won't even open the door or curtains in his apartment. I don't know if this person wants to add to that question, but.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. And this is certainly a lot of dialogue at the moment around a lot of individuals who would have already experienced or have been struggling with, say, for example, OCD tendencies, behaviours and so forth, that ambiguous situations like this, in these periods of uncertainty, and it's situations, examples like this where what can help you and what can help the person that you're concerned about is probably professional support. And at that point, to either seek professional support or extend an invitation to that person to often feel from the people we care about, but to recognise that we do as good a job as we can, even under normal circumstances, and that it is difficult to accept that we may not be in a position to help them entirely, and at that point we need additional support.
Yeah, I think everybody's streaming Netflix right now, so we were having a little bit of difficulty, at least I was on my end, hearing your complete answer.
Yeah.
But I think I'll just throw out there as well is that I want to encourage this person to seek out a resource like, we have folks from across the country joining us this evening, but if you're here locally, our local mental health authority is Integral Care, and they have a number that you can call 512-472-HELP, so that you can get a chance to talk to a clinician that can help walk you through that. So I certainly want to encourage that. And then if you live outside of the Central Texas area here, just every county across the United States is affiliated with some local mental health authority, and many of them do have similar services where they've got a helpline that you can call. So, because I think I sort of heard you saying that at the end as well, Simon, where that might be need to bring in a professional's assessment in terms of what to do next. Okay.
Yes.
We've only got about
absolutely to support there.
We've only got about a minute left, and so and we've got some more questions. I'm trying to see if any of them sort of overlap so we can sort of combine them. There was a couple of questions related to teens and kids, which I think if you can come back and join us next week, we'll be covering that. And so they sort of took note that they could join us then. Let's I want to answer this one real quick. We have somebody who reached out who just said, for those who do not have health insurance that are having mental health issues, how can they get help? And so I did want to point out again, contacting your local mental health authority. If you're in the Austin area, that's Integral Care or Bluebonnet Trails, and they all have numbers that you can contact, and they do take folks that don't have health insurance. So I would look at those kinds of resources. And then if you want to just answer one more question, Simon, and then we'll finish up. My daughter has adult children who live at home, and one has 2 kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
The adult children want to go out and visit their friends and boyfriends. Any suggestions on what kind of healthy boundaries or tough love might be appropriate?
Yeah. This is we're hearing stories like this. Yeah, this is a difficult one because there are a lot of individuals who are at risk, and there are a lot of individuals. There are some individuals who may sort of see themselves as circumstance. Establishing the rights of boundaries to recognise that there might be a little bit of tough love to sort of really voice one's concern, to say, well, if you, so for example, don't quarantine yourself, don't isolate yourself, you are essentially putting invitation to those individuals to say is maintained. Would you? And extending that invitation. Now, obviously, it is up to that person on whether or not they're willing or able to adhere to that particular request. And in some instances, we might actually have to take some grief from well-being. Now, I don't know what that means to the individual who's asked the question, or really what potential consequences they could put in place, or how they would maintain those boundaries. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are having to make some very stern decisions around ensuring their care, their well-being and their health is maintained and protected. So that's a very difficult situation to be in. So sometimes firm boundaries, a little bit of tough love, and in some cases, again, reaching out, seeking support from others who might be able to help reinforce those boundaries on your behalf.
Okay, well, we're right at 8:03, so we want to honor people's time, and certainly yours as well, Simon. Thank you so much for joining in this evening and for giving us some things to think about in terms of how we navigate these sort of uncertain times. I think you gave us some great suggestions and ideas to think about. And then I want to encourage all of you, especially those of you who have kiddos,